welcome to this video where I'm gonna show you how I made a skirt inspired from my Pinterest board. So enjoy! So the first thing I did was to look through my Pinterest board. Yeah, at least I found the skirt I wanted to remake. Well, actually, at first I wanted to remake it, but when I found out it wasn't made by a or what I perceived as a big corporation, I sort of felt bad for remaking their design. So I ended up making a pretty different skirt, but this was my inspiration. And then I found one of my own patterns, which kind of resembled the shape, and I kind of analyzed it and found out how I had to adjust the pattern to fit my needs. And so that was what I did. And now I'm going to show you how I transformed a regular A-line skirt pattern to this more fancy A-line skirt pattern. Alright, so when looking at my pattern in comparison to the skirt I took inspiration from, I noticed one main type of difference, and that was the parting of the panels of the skirt, because the general shape is pretty much alike. So, to understand what's behind the skirt or how to be able to adjust it to my needs, I wanted to look at what pieces my pattern was made up of. And this is a visual representation of the Stoff&stil pattern, or there is one mistake, which is the fact that the front panel is actually parted in two, and it's the inner lining front panel, which is one part. But yeah, this is generally how the pattern looks. Moving on, I firstly decided to take away the waistband because I didn't want a waistband. So I rather included a inner lining at the top, which didn't look exactly like the inner lining I've painted on the top here, but this is just to get a general idea. I'll show you later what the inner lining at the top looked like. And I also decided to quit the full-size inner linings because I didn't want a very warm skirt, because I wanted to wear it in summer. And also I concluded with having the skirt consist of 3 main parts, which was 2 back panels and 1 front panel. And then I decided to part these 3 panels in 2 with a diagonal line. And when doing this, you need to be a little bit aware of what you're doing, because you can't just draw a diagonal line and expect it to align when you're sewing the side seams together. To understand how this works, you can draw a diagonal line on a piece of paper, take it in your hand and fold it in 2, holding a bit of the fabric in the palm of your hand while folding out the rest of the paper. And then you'll see that the lines don't align. And this is sort of how it works when you're sewing, because you're taking away fabric for the seam allowance. And I'll later on show you a hack for making these align and make it look professional. But yeah, I think trial and error is the key to succeeding here. And the next thing I did to my pattern was parting the upper panel of the middle piece, or the front panel, in 3 parts. So here is a visual representation of what the adjusted pattern looked like, or at least sort of what it looked like, because as I mentioned, the inner lining at the top doesn't look like this at the end. But yeah, I would recommend to prolong your pattern both at the top and at the bottom, because making sure your diagonal seams align could like eat some of your fabric, so it's good to have some extra. The pink lines are here to mark seam allowances, because if you just copy your original pattern and then just cut pieces that go across the lines you've marked, you'll end up with a skirt that is too little. And to make sure this doesn't happen, you have to add seam allowance. And I added about 1.5 centimeters of seam allowance per seam, because that was about what the initial pattern had. As you can see, there are pink lines both above and under and on both sides of these adjustments of the pattern, and that is because if you cut out the bottom piece, you'll have to get a seam allowance at the top, and when you cut out the top piece, you have to take the seam allowance on the bottom of the seam. Okay, this didn't make that much sense, but I hope the visual representation kind of made it make sense. To start my sewing process, I found some of my leftover and ugly fabrics to make a mock-up. Mock-ups are really great for practicing, especially if you're using your own pattern, because it allows you to practice on a fabric which you don't value as much, and you don't risk wasting the actual fabric you want to use on something that didn't work. The mock-up I just sewed as I would do on the actual skirt. I just wasn't as neat as you would have to be on the final piece. I was pretty happy with the result. One of my side seams alignments with the diagonal seam looked good, and the other one didn't align. It's kind of hard to see, but I just moved one of them up or down. I don't quite remember, but I at least adjusted it so that the seams aligned. Other than that, I was happy and I could move on. I kind of regret making a voiceover and not just putting music over, but I promise it's coming. Just wait. Anyways, when I had made my mock-up, I decided which fabric I actually wanted to use on my skirt. And I had this vision about making in a dark denim, but I didn't have dark denim, and buying dark denim is not only expensive, it's not good for the climate, so I stayed #sustainable and found some fabric from my own stash. And I found these options. As you can see, I had one in dark blue, but I didn't think it was enough, so I decided to go for this dark grayish. I first thought it was wool, but then I kind of found out it wasn't, and it was made in a very strange way. But when I did the bias test, which you can kind of do to check which way the threads go, because the bias will always be the most stretchy, that was also the case here. So the threading had to be normal, but it just looked like it was diagonal. Yeah, so I don't know, I just cut out the pieces like it was a normal fabric, and I should also note that in the pattern I made the direction of the threading be parallel to the lines that were straight in the pattern, and that means the middle of the two pieces in the back, and the line you get if you fold the front piece in two is sort of straight up and down, and I made that the threading direction. After that, I sewed zigzag stitches around all the edges of my pieces. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't want to make a skirt that resembled my inspiration exactly, so I thought it would be fun to use a contrasting thread to get sort of a industrial look. So here you can see me choosing out the thread I'm going to use for the contrasting stitches. Next on the agenda was to sew together the 3 panels at the top of the front panel. And this I did before I changed my threading to the contrasting thread, because these seams were sewn right sides together, and then you want a thread that matches the color of your fabric so that it doesn't show when the seams get pulled. But after I sewed these seams right sides together, I sewed them open after ironing them flat and open, so that you get contrasting seams. So every seam on this skirt that is sewn right sides facing each other is sewn with gray thread, and every contrasting stitch is sewn with this denim thread. Later on, I sewed the 3 top panels of the front with the lower front panel, and then after having sewed both the right sides facing each other seams and the contrasting seams, I sewed the side panels together with each other with the same technique. Welcome to the most chaotic part of the video, the zipper. I obviously needed to add some sort of opening or closure to the skirt in order to be able to get in and out of the skirt, so I decided to go for this metal zipper. To sew in my zipper, I first sewed up the 2 back panels together up until about 15 centimeters, or the length of my zipper's length at the top. You leave a gap at the top in order to sew the zipper in place. And as you can see, I wasn't very happy with my decision to sew in this metal zipper, so I actually changed my mind and went for this blue invisible zipper, because I had no other invisible zipper, up until I actually destroyed this blue zipper because I had to get it out of the fabric I had sewn it to previously. So I ended up buying a invisible black zipper, and I was very happy with my decision. But showing how to sew a invisible zipper is even harder than actually sewing it in place, so I'm not going to show you that. But my tip is actually just sewing it by hand, because when I sew invisible zippers, they move so much that I lose all control if I'm gonna sew them by machine, so I just sew them by hand, and then they actually turn out pretty good and become pretty invisible. So I was very happy with my zipper. Lastly, I had to finish up my top and bottom hem. To do this, I measured all around the perimeter of the bottom hem, and then I cut out a rectangular piece of fabric, which I sewed right sides facing each other to the bottom hem. And at the top, I made a copy of the skirt, which I also sewed right sides facing each other. I used a technique called stitch in the ditch, which basically helps your fabric fold inside itself. When you're using this technique, you want to take your seam allowance and pull it under the fabric that you want to be folded inside. In this case, that will be the lining. So you are going to take your seam allowance and pull it under the lining, and then you're going to sew a top stitch at the top of the lining side, and then your lining will move much smoother inside of the fashion fabric. To secure the bottom hem in place, I sewed it by hand all around the perimeter. And at the top, I used the same technique, stitch in the ditch, but here I didn't sew it in place by hand. I just let it hang loose, except the part by the zipper, because I didn't want the fabric to interfere with the zipper. And then my skirt was done.